Imagine a world where April 26, 1986 was not just remembered as the day of the Chernobyl nuclear accident, but as the day humanity's fate took a sharp, irreversible turn. Most of us know Chernobyl as a disaster confined largely to Ukraine and Belarus, with its eerie abandoned city of Pripyat standing as a monument to human hubris. But what if it hadn't been confined? What if the reactor explosion in Soviet Ukraine had spiraled out of control, not just contaminating parts of Europe, but triggering a chain reaction that poisoned entire continents, collapsed governments, and reshaped civilization as we know it? This is the haunting What If we'll explore today. In this episode of Renaissance Reframed, we step into a chilling alternate history. What if Chernobyl caused a global nuclear disaster? To understand the stakes of this alternate history, we need to revisit what actually happened. On that fateful night of April 25th to 26th, engineers at Reactor 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant were running a safety test. The test aimed to simulate a power outage and measure how long the turbines could keep coolant pumps running. But due to poor planning, design flaws in the RBMK reactor, and dangerous operator decisions, the situation spiraled out of control. At 1:23 a.m., two massive explosions blew the reactor core apart. The roof was torn off. Fire and chunks of glowing radioactive graphite were hurled into the night sky. What followed was 9 days of fire, radioactive isotopes, iodine-131, cesium-137, strontium-90 were spewed into the atmosphere. The fallout reached as far as Sweden and the United Kingdom. In real history, Soviet firefighters, soldiers, and liquidators, thousands of them, sacrificed themselves to contain the disaster. Helicopters dropped sand and boron onto the burning core. Workers tunneled beneath the reactor to install cooling systems. Many of these men knew their exposure was lethal, but they did it anyway. It was horrific, but it was not the end of the world. In reality, only one reactor exploded, and somehow the chain of events was stopped. But what if those containment efforts had failed? Here's where our alternate timeline begins. In this scenario, the explosion at Reactor 4 doesn't just eject radioactive material upward. The fire spreads through the turbine hall, an area shared with other units, igniting fuel and damaging cooling systems in reactors 1, 2, and 3. Now, we don't have one reactor on fire. We have 4, and each reactor is releasing radioactive material equivalent to dozens of Hiroshima bombs into the atmosphere every hour. The Soviet authorities are paralyzed. Evacuation of Pripyat, which in real history happened 36 hours after the accident, comes far too late. Instead of 50,000 evacuees, hundreds of thousands are trapped in a radioactive inferno. The sky above northern Ukraine turns into a nuclear storm cloud. And the real terror comes not from the fire itself, but from what happens next when that cloud begins to drift. Within days, radioactive clouds sweep across Europe. Unlike the real disaster, where the fallout was terrible, but localized, this version sees millions of curies of radiation carried into the jet stream. Poland, East Germany, and Czechoslovakia, record lethal levels. Radiation alarms in Sweden and Finland don't just spike, they break. Scandinavia's forests wither. Lakes turn into silent reservoirs of contamination. By week 2, the United Kingdom reports a sharp rise in infant mortality. The government quietly destroys milk supplies, orders livestock to be slaughtered, and bans vegetables grown outdoors. By week 3, radioactive rain falls across France, Spain, and Italy. Vineyards, farmlands, and fisheries are ruined. Crops glow under Geiger counters. Food that looks perfectly safe becomes poisonous. And it doesn't stop there. The jet stream carries particles across the Atlantic. By the summer of 1986, radiation levels in Canada and the northeastern United States rise to dangerous levels. Milk in New York fails. Safety tests. Farmers in Ontario plow. Entire fields under. Watching years of work dissolve into ash. This is no longer a Soviet problem. It is not even a European problem. The entire world realizes it is facing a global catastrophe. The death toll soars. In real history, a few dozen firefighters and workers died within weeks. Thousands more later suffered from cancer. But in this alternate history, the casualties mount into the hundreds of thousands within months. Kiev, Minsk, even Moscow are partially evacuated. Trains packed with families flee north, west, and east, carrying little more than what they can hold in their hands. Refugee camps spring up overnight, overflowing with terrified civilians. The Soviet Union, already weakened by economic stagnation, begins to collapse 5 years earlier than it did in our timeline. Instead of falling in 1991, the USSR disintegrates in 1986 under the unbearable weight of crisis. Entire republics break away, radioactive or not, leaving Moscow in chaos. Meanwhile, Western Europe faces its own nightmare. Germany, France, and Italy are forced to ration food. Farmers slaughter. entire herds of cattle, rather than risk radioactive meat entering the food chain. Grocery shelves are empty. Children are born sick. Hospitals are overwhelmed. Generations are marked forever by cancers, genetic mutations, and grief. This is not just a nuclear accident anymore. It is the largest humanitarian crisis in human history. Now let's think geopolitics. In 1986, the Cold War was at its height. Ronald Reagan sat in the White House. Mikhail Gorbachev was trying to reform. The Soviet Union with its policy of glasnost, openness. But in this alternate history, Chernobyl does not become a story of cover-up and reform. It becomes a political apocalypse. NATO countries accuse the Soviet Union of negligence, even of sabotage. Propaganda campaigns spread images of radioactive clouds drifting westward, painting Moscow as reckless and dangerous. The USSR, desperate for international aid, can barely maintain order home. The Warsaw Pact countries, Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, see their population suffering. They turn against Moscow. Protests erupt, not just demanding reform, but demanding freedom. Instead of a slow, controlled fall of the Iron Curtain, we see the entire Soviet bloc collapse overnight in fire and fury. Could this chaos have triggered World War III? Not with missiles deliberately launched, but with a kind of desperate, accidental escalation that happens when empires crumble under fear. It is a chilling possibility. But the disaster doesn't stop at politics. It spreads to technology itself. In the panic, nations around the world rush to shut down their nuclear power plants. Safety checks are botched. Maintenance crews are pushed to the limit. And accidents happen. Imagine a partial meltdown in East Germany, a cooling system failure in Bulgaria, even a small incident in France. Each one adds fuel to the fire of public fear. Extremist sabotage nuclear plants, claiming they are preventing the next Chernobyl. Governments abandon nuclear projects entirely, but without nuclear power, they turn back to coal and oil, triggering massive energy shortages and skyrocketing pollution. Cities plunge into rolling blackouts. The global economy teeters on collapse. The promise of clean, powerful nuclear energy vanishes, perhaps forever. Now let's look at nature. In our reality, the Chernobyl exclusion zone covers about 30 kilometers, where forests, rivers, and fields remain unsafe. But in this alternate history, the poison regions stretch across entire countries. Much of Ukraine, Belarus, and Western Russia become uninhabitable. Scandinavia's wilderness becomes a dead zone. The Danube, the Vistula, the Dnieper, all major European rivers, carry radioactive particles into the Black Sea, then into the Mediterranean. Fisheries collapse. Crops fail. Even faraway regions like Africa and South America, though spared direct fallout, face famine because global trade grinds to a halt. And here's the darkest truth. Radiation doesn't just poison one generation. It lingers. It mutates DNA. It alters ecosystems. Entire species vanish. Others mutate in unpredictable ways. Humanity faces not just a disaster, but the shadow of extinction. But how does humanity respond to such darkness? Religion surges. Some see it as Judgment Day. Apocalyptic cults spread across Europe, and America, preaching that the end has come. People flock to churches, temples, and mosques, desperate for answers. Art reflects despair. The late 1980s. Instead of bringing us MTV, neon consumer culture, and global pop, deliver a new nuclear gothic, dark music, bleak films, dystopian literature. Science changes direction too. Instead of racing for stars, billions are poured into radiation medicine, whole fields of biology, genetics, and nuclear engineering pivot overnight toward survival. Would humanity, united by tragedy, finally learn humility? Or would nations turn inward, hoarding resources and letting the weakest perish? That choice defines this alternate world. By the 1990s, the world looks nothing like the one we know. The Soviet Union has collapsed into chaos, splintering into radioactive states. Europe suffers a lost generation of children scarred by sickness. The United States, less affected but still struggling, emerges as a last superpower, though haunted by paranoia about nuclear energy. By the 2000s, fossil fuels dominate once again. Climate change accelerates a decade earlier. Refugee crises reshape global politics. Walls are built, borders harden. Humanity survives, but barely. We enter the 21st century, not with optimism, but with fear, suspicion, and decline. This chilling alternate history is a warning. Chernobyl reminds us that technology, when poorly managed, can threaten the entire species. Secrecy, denial, and political games magnify disasters into cataclysms. In our reality, humanity was lucky. The meltdown was contained, though at an unimaginable cost to those who sacrifice themselves. But next time, we may not be so fortunate. Fukushima in 2011 showed us that nuclear danger still lurks, and even today, fragile nuclear plants continue to operate in unstable parts of the world. The line between local accident and global catastrophe is thinner than we want to admit. So, what if Chernobyl had caused a global nuclear disaster? We might be living in a darker, fractured, and poisoned world. Civilization might have survived, but only barely. History often hinges on moments where disaster could have spiraled beyond imagination. Chernobyl was one of those moments. And perhaps the real lesson is this: humanity's survival has always depended on how wisely or foolishly we manage the tools we create. This has been Renaissance Reframed. Thank you for joining me in this journey through alternate history. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, because the more we understand the fragility of our past, the better we can safeguard our future.